Bonjour, bienvenue. Mon nom est Erwin Cutler, député de Montréal. Je suis accompagné aujourd'hui par le ministre de la Justice, Peter MacKay, par le leader du Parti Vert, Elizabeth May, and we are here today on the eve of the anniversary of Nelson Mandela's passing to take up the cause of three political prisoners who are themselves embodying the ethos of Mandela's courage and commitment and have been inspired by him. As you know, Nelson Mandela is a world historical figure who emerged after 28 years in a South African prison to not only preside over the dismantling of apartheid, but to become president of a democratic, egalitarian, non-racial South Africa. And we stand here today to call for the release of three political prisoners who embody that courage and a commitment and embody also the hopes of their people. I'll begin by asking the Minister of Justice, Peter MacKay, to take up the first of the three prisoners, Ayatollah Bourjedi of Iran, known there as Iran's Mandela. Minister.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotler. Ms. May, I believe my colleague Scott Reed may be joining us, ladies and gentlemen. As Erwin Kotler has stated, it is very poignant that we gather at this time on the eve of the anniversary of Nelson Mandela's death, knowing that there are similar leaders currently incarcerated for their struggle to bring about freedom and democracy and greater human rights in their countries. And we are truly gathered here in the name of justice and in that spirit of Nelson Mandela to support three extraordinary people who are enduring very unfavorable circumstances as political prisoners and who have been characterized as Mandelas of their countries. And while most will agree that there is no single person alone who is like Nelson Mandela, these three who we speak of today are among others who, in fact, embody the spirit of leading a struggle for a free and democratic country for their people. The promotion and protection of human rights is an integral part of the Canadian justice system, along with its foreign policy. Canada takes principled positions on important issues to promote freedom and democracy and human rights and the rule of law. And being here with my colleagues from the Canadian Parliament in a unified expression of our support for those who promote these values in their countries is similar in expression of what a nonpartisan this issue truly is. Today I've been asked to speak about one of these three political prisoners, an extraordinary man currently incarcerated in Iran, separation of religion and state for condemning the theocratic nature of the Iranian regime, which he feels drives people from religion, and he has been an advocate, as well as having called for a referendum for a free Iran. Like Mandela, he spoke of the existing regime at a time of his life being a risk for personal safety. And like Mandela, he has spent years now, 8 years in fact, behind bars for his unrelenting and unrepentant views. Like Mandela, he has a large following, making him a threat to authorities currently in power. And many will know that Mandela condemned apartheid in Iran. This man has repeatedly condemned the gender apartheid that exists in Iran, as well as the persecution of ethnic and religious minorities. His name is Ayatollah Hossein Khamenei Bourjedi. He is an Iranian Shia Muslim critic who, like his father and grandfather before him, has long advocated for the separation of religion and state, as I mentioned, and he has been an outspoken critic of the current regime. Ayatollah Bourjedi wrote an open letter to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, accusing him of being responsible for the violations of human rights in Iran and calling for a free referendum in Iran directly supervised by UN observers. As a result of vocalizing criticism of Iran's authority and the system, calling it, quote, a totalitarian and corrupt dictatorship where the crown has been replaced by the turban, he was charged with waging war against God and spreading propaganda against the system. All of this resulted in him initially being sentenced to death in 2006 when he was first arrested. And interesting to note, when arrested, several hundred of his followers gathered outside his home to prevent his arrest. His sentence has subsequently been reduced to 11 years in prison because of international and domestic pressure, proving that the voice of the international community does matter. And while this pressure continues, last month he was told anew by prison officials that he would soon be executed. The threat of his execution came only one day after the latest letter to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was published, where he strongly criticized the government of Iran for mishandling the country's economy through corruption. In the past 8 years, while he has been in prison due to poor health and poor prison conditions, his health has continuously deteriorated, as well as the worsening of a pre-existing condition that he has. He has continually been denied the medical attention that he needs. And while Canada has strongly condemned his imprisonment and treatment, others, including Minister Baird, have spoken out against his treatment. And there are currently hundreds of prisoners, political prisoners of conscience, imprisoned in Iran. Many of those who, like Mr. Boujardi, have been imprisoned simply for exercising their right of freedom of expression, association, and assembly. Others here would know as well that children are among those who are imprisoned for such things as apostasy and homosexuality, and many are executed for same. I find it an honor to be here today with two of my parliamentary colleagues who have both been outspoken advocates for prisoners who are held for reasons beyond our understanding in Canada because of our own democratic rights and freedoms of expression here. But I do believe that ultimately our justice system is only as effective as the strength of the public's trust in it. And governments must continually strive to ensure that their justice system evolves with its citizens. To conclude, it's my hope that we will in fact see a just outcome for all political prisoners that we've heard about here today. My colleagues will speak of Leopoldo Lopez of Venezuela and Biram Da Abid, and as well, of course, for Mr. Boujardi. I close with a quote from Nelson Mandela when he said, "We must use time wisely and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do what is right." Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Minister. That may be the most important statement that has yet been made on behalf of Ayatollah Boujardi. As we meet, he is languishing in prison and being denied urgent medical care that is warranted. And he has been denied the right to counsel throughout his imprisonment. Happily, today, he has secured the best of counsel in our Justice Minister. I'm now delighted to ask Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, who will take up the case of Biram Abiad, who just a month ago was arrested. He has been the leading anti-slavery advocate in Mauritania, which has, and this is not sufficiently known, the largest ratio of slaves of any country in the world today. Elizabeth.
Thank you to Irwin Cotler. Je suis ici avec mes collègues parlementaires. C'est un grand honneur d'être ici. Et nous sommes ensemble, avec le même but, pour la libération des prisonniers politiques. Et aussi, aujourd'hui, c'est comme Irwin Cotler a dit, c'est le veille de l'anniversaire du décès de M. Nelson Mandela, le vrai héros de tous les gens qui veulent la vraie liberté, égalité pour tout le monde. So on the eve of the anniversary of Nelson Mandela, I speak to the case of the man in his country, Mauritania, known as the Nelson Mandela of Mauritania. His name is Biram Da Abiad. He has been arrested for campaigning to end a practice that is already illegal in Mauritania. Several times Mauritania has passed laws against slavery, and yet the shocking statistic is it's estimated that 20% of the population of Mauritania is currently enslaved. What Mr. Abieda was doing was working with a movement of which he is the president, a revival of an abolitionist movement, holding rallies, traveling through the country, and pressuring the government of Mauritania to end the practice of slavery. It's called the Caravan of Liberty, and they had been touring Mauritania peacefully, organizing and raising awareness when, on Remembrance Day of this year, he and 5 others were arrested for expressing their political beliefs, and in the aid, again, of a law in Mauritania that already makes slavery illegal, but which is treated with blind disregard. Slavery is institutionalized in Mauritania. 20% de la population de la Mauritanie était maintenant d'esclaves. C'est incroyable. We give our full support and we urge the government of Mauritania to release Mr. Abdia and the 5 others arrested with him, and to put serious efforts to end the practice of slavery in Mauritania. I just want to make one other point. Some people think things like this aren't possible, but if Erwin Kotler can get Peter MacKay and me together for a press conference, anything is possible.
Merci, comme vous avez, nous sommes ici unifiés dans la cause commune qui nous rassemble, la libération des prisonniers politiques. I just want to mention that Tyron Benskin of the NDP joins us, but not himself to be here because he is in a committee meeting and therefore cannot join us. But I'm delighted that we have Scott Reed here, the chair of our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights. Scott, would you like to join us here? And we had a week ago the visit of the wife of the imprisoned leader in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez. She was here together with their counsel, Jared Genzer. They appeared before the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights, which is chaired by Scott Reed. After their compelling testimony, they met with the leaders of all parties and secured their support, and the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, under Scott's leadership, unanimously adopted a resolution condemning Leopoldo Lopez's imprisonment and calling for his release. So I'll now ask Scott to speak to the case of Leopoldo Lopez.
Well, I'll speak very briefly to this. I do want to correct one incorrect thing that Erwin said, which is under Scott Reed's leadership. That's not true. Our committee functions. It's actually the only committee or subcommittee on Parliament Hill that functions this way, completely on consensus. We never move forward on any item that does not meet with a consensus. We never pass a resolution without consensus. We don't invite witnesses without consensus of all the parties. As a practical matter, that involves just the officially recognized parties, but as a statement of fact, we've always had the support of Ms. May as well in these matters. Leopoldo Lopez is distinguished, very distinguished Venezuelan Democrat who is deeply respectful of his country's constitutional heritage and, if I may say, a spiritual heritage dating back to Simon Bolivar, and who has attempted to move forward that agenda in the face of a government which, having maintained a revolutionary ideology, but having lost its way, now seeks to stifle those who would enact the genuine ideals of the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan nationalism. He has served as a public servant, but has been imprisoned in recent years as a result of his outspokenness. His wife came and testified before our committee very movingly, and I think her testimony speaks for itself, as does our motion in his support. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I just want to mention with regard to Leopoldo Lopez that his case resonates now. He has some 3.5 million people who follow him on Twitter. and we are in a Twitter universe, he makes substantive submissions. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention called his imprisonment arbitrary, illegal, and called for his release. And that UN Working Group has been joined from everyone from Pope Francis to President Obama to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States to leaders of European countries, and if I may add, somewhat modestly, our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee in its unanimous resolution. So we're now open to any questions that you may have for each of the people here. Yeah.
I'm Peter Stoffman from the Catholic Register. I'd like to just follow up on Ms. May's comment about anything being possible. And I'd like to frame the question in reference to the elephant that isn't in the room, which is that there are more people on the podium than there actually are reporters here, our friends with cameras notwithstanding. I don't mean that as a critique of anybody, but just as a reference point in terms of the difficulty of moving this issue, these particular cases, into public consciousness. How do you do that? How do you get Canadians to understand, with all the other welter of issues that are before us, that these things actually do matter, not only in the world, but in their lives?
Just briefly, I think it requires sustained and determined effort, of which this is but a drop in the ocean, to use an expression my wife often uses. And I think we need, of course, the cooperation of the mainstream media. Mr. Kotler mentioned social media, which has become increasingly an important venue in which to platform outreach, to tell these stories, to mention the struggle that continues in so many parts of the world. And I think personalizing it, quite frankly, that is what resonates with many. Tying the names of these three individuals to Nelson Mandela, I think, is also part of the effort to elevate the discussion. Mr. Mandela's leadership, a giant of an individual on the international scene, I think, for point of reference, makes this effort all the more real. But it will always, of course, require international bodies, the UN, of course, all international bodies, NGOs, and that collective will and spirit, I think, is what will eventually lead to a safer, better place for all. Elizabeth?
Just going to say that the challenge is always in a backdrop where politics is covered more often for scandal than for higher purpose, the willingness to cooperate and to stand together with a common purpose. I would hope that this message resonates, particularly because of our Justice Minister, Peter MacKay, being here with us. It's not a normal occurrence on Parliament Hill, and I wish it happened more often. I'm deeply grateful to you, Peter, for being here, and of course to the leadership of Irwin Cotler, whom I regard as one of the finest people I've ever known. And we're together because we know that people are unjustly imprisoned for beliefs that are they're supported by the UN Declaration on Human Rights, that are the norms internationally, and yet somebody like Baram Da Abied is in prison for upholding a law of his country to end slavery. So one of Nelson Mandela's quotes, and I may be paraphrasing it, but I hope I've got it right, which is, everything seems impossible until after it's done. And we need to hold fast and mobilize, and there are wonderful, we know the membership of groups like Amnesty International. It's grassroots, it's civil society. It doesn't stop, it doesn't rest, it pushes forward. And you're right, a missing ingredient often is media coverage, but the pressure is there, and there is widespread popular support for the release of these men.
Your question is reminiscent of one. I was here 36 years ago. That time I was a law professor. I was here with Avital Sharansky, the wife of the then imprisoned Soviet dissident Anatoly Sharansky. We had one person here for a press conference, and the person who was asking the question said, what is this going to do? Nobody really came, etc. Avital Sharansky answered as Peter MacKay did, very much speaking to the importance that the media has in this. And then she added, I know one thing. If we didn't have this press conference, my husband would never be released and no one might know of his existence. At least with this press conference, we are beginning the call for his release, and I believe that someday he will be released. So let me just close by telling you a story that in 1984, Gorbachev visited the Canadian Parliament. After Sharansky was released a year after within a year of Gorbachev becoming the head of the Soviet Union. I met Gorbachev years later. We were on a panel together, and I asked him what was his role in Sharansky's release. And through a translator, he answered me as follows. He said, "You may not believe this, but when I came to Canada, I had never heard of Anatoly Sharansky. I know that he had become a household word in Canada. I never heard of him," he said. So I came before the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture. It's an amazing story, Peter. He said, and I thought I would be getting questions on agriculture, but the parliamentarians started asking me about this Anatoly Sharansky. He said, I left the Parliament buildings. There was a big demonstration, he said, and they were talking about this Anatoly Sharansky. I met with the Minister of Agriculture in Canada at the time, and yes, we talked about agriculture, but he kept bringing up the case of Anatoly Sharansky. So I returned to the Soviet Union. I then became president of the Soviet Union. I asked for his file. He said, I looked at the file. Yes, he was a bit of a troublemaker, he said, but he certainly was not a criminal. He said, but it was costing us to keep him in prison. It was costing us economically, politically, it was costing us in terms of our legitimacy. So I ordered his release. That's the power, of public advocacy on behalf of an imprisoned dissident and political prisoner.
Question for Mr. McKay. I hope you'll permit me to switch gears. There's word this morning that David Langtry from the Canadian Commission for Human Rights expensed taxpayers $760,000 during the past 8 years. He was an appointment that was made by one of your predecessors. I'm wondering, first of all, your reaction to the number, and secondly, whether there was anybody in Ottawa who could do the job.
Well, yes, it is a significant number. For these positions, of course, there is a process of application and vetting, and we look to employ the best candidate, and Mr. Langtry was that chosen candidate. I have just received reports of this, and so we're looking at those numbers. Clearly, taxpayers' accountability is an extremely important part of our government's agenda. And until such time as we get those numbers and verify them, this is coming from the Taxpayers Association, I know, who are so vigilant in examining these expenses. So we'll look at those numbers, and I'll have some.
It shocks you?
It is a significant bill, and it is taxpayers' money. So for sure, we have to verify all of those expenses and ask hard questions.
Any other questions? I want to thank the minister for being with us. As I said, in my view, somebody who's had some involvement in Ayatollah Bourgetti's case, that has been his statement today, the most important submission on behalf of the imprisoned Ayatollah, as I said, known as Iran's Mandela, that I've witnessed in this case, and he's been denied, as I said, legal counsel. I want to commend Elizabeth May for her submission on behalf of Abiy. I think that, too, represents the most important call that has been made yet on his behalf. He's been imprisoned only for a month, but we want to secure his release. And again, Scott Reed's modesty prevents him from even allowing the truth to be told that he does preside, and through his leadership, we unanimously adopted that resolution. I invite you to take a copy of that resolution of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. It's here today. It sets forth all the findings of fact and conclusions of law in that case. And thank you for being with us. And let us hope that our coming together in common cause today will result in the release of the political prisoners, as it did when we came together for Anatoly Sharansky. Thank you.